Just be warned, today's rant will probably be a long one. So if you're not in the mood for a long video, by all means, go about your day or come back later. But we're going to talk about Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, and something very terrifying I can see on the horizon. There's another shooting at Florida State this week. And I say another shooting at Florida State because there was a shooting back in 2014 at Florida State as well. And I don't want to give away people's business, right? But I had a student at FSU back in 2014 who narrowly missed being in the library that night. And I have a student at FSU right now, a couple students at FSU right now, who I immediately had to know if they were safe. Blessed be, I had a student email me that I hadn't talked to in a couple years. Miss Cannon, I wanted you to know I was safe. And I started crying until I heard from the other student, right? But I had to go about my day like it was normal. I was still in my classroom, fully expected to be teaching loanable fund markets, while I was wondering if my kids, because they're my kids, were okay. Everybody is safe. And I need you to know that. And that is important. And I will forever be grateful to God and everybody for that. But ever since, I've been thinking, because I also had a really rough week this week with a lot of things. And it's putting pieces together in my brain. So let's go back to the 1960s. UC Berkeley and the Reagan gubernatorial hellscape that was California. Now, a lot of you probably know that California was the destination of the hippies, and UC Berkeley in the 1960s became sort of a hub for like anti-war protests and like basically the hippie movement in general. And when Reagan ran to be governor of California, he called them brats and bums and promised to clean up UC Berkeley and basically ban like the protests of these students and like even non-students, just young people protesting. And that should sound familiar, Floridians, because it's like exactly the play Ron DeSantis is trying to use now in Florida schools, right? Fast forward a couple of years. They're now in April of 1970, and Richard Nixon, who largely won the presidency in 1968 because of disaffected left-wing voters who were mad at Lyndon Johnson for escalating the Vietnam War, and mad that the Democratic Party collapsed at its convention in 68. And Nixon comes in with promises of law and order, and instead of, ending the war like people thought he would, he decides to invade Cambodia because Henry Kissinger was a person. Obviously, student protests blow up because they'd been pissed about this for many years already, and they burned down the ROTC building at Kent State University. Not their finest moment, student protesters, but the same way Reagan had used the National Guard in California to break up student protests, Tricky Dick says that's a great idea and sends in the U.S. National Guard to Kent State University to control the protesters. And very Boston Massacre style, the kids start throwing rocks and calling them names, so the National Guard opens fire. 67 shots, and they kill a bunch of kids. This was one of those watershed moments in the country. Everybody's like, the fuck, Dick? What'd you do? And even his own advisors, even his own administration was like, seriously, bro. Seriously, bro. Now, somehow Nixon still gets reelected after this because that should just show you how deeply collapsed the Democratic Party was, that even after opening fire on a college campus, the motherfucker got reelected, but only after breaking into the Democratic headquarters to steal all their information and covering it up. Normal shit these days. Here we are now in the aftermath of yet another college student getting a weapon somehow and opening fire on their college campus. And this is all happening in the wake of college protests against military actions in support of the American government in Israel with regards to Palestine. And we know Donald Trump is not exactly a supporter of the Palestinian cause. And he's made some big threats as to how he will handle Palestinian protesters. And he's even using Palestinian protests as part of his reasoning for rounding kids up, canceling visas, and disappearing them to our El Salvadorian gulag. which we get for the low, low price of $6 billion of US tax dollars a year. $6 billion of our money is being spent to torture people in another country. And that's happened before, but I thought Gitmo was like another watershed moment where the country looked and said, you know what, we're better than this. This isn't who we are, but apparently we've always been this. Why am I talking about Reagan and Nixon with respect to a school shooting where a kid took a gun onto a school campus? Because it's a matter of time before a kid takes a gun on a school campus that the National Guard is already on, right? When you put these kind of timelines together, when you have a wannabe Reagan and Ron DeSantis trying to use the National Guard to control state-level universities, and you have a tyrant in training trying to deport everybody from the country that doesn't agree with him and is totally fine with the idea of opening fire on protesters, it is a matter of time before these two national crises converge, and you have a situation where a broken down young person gets violent on their campus and is met with excessive force by U.S. military responders. And I don't know what the next Kent State is going to look like. I don't know what the next FSU is going to look like. And I sure as shit don't know what it will look like when those two things are happening together at the same time. But this is a fucking 5-alarm fire. And I need people to pay more attention to it. Now, Big Ten universities have kind of come together in like, I don't know, for lack of a better way of describing it, an academic NATO to defend against the Trump administration. And I need every college to be doing that, right? Like, don't be the Columbia universities of the world that bend the knee and kiss the ring, right? You're just enabling the next Kent State to happen. You're enabling the next UC Berkeley. You're enabling the next wannabe tyrant becoming a tyrant. You're a line of defense, right? We're still all crossing our fingers and our toes and hoping that the U.S. military remembers they swore their oath to the Constitution and to protect us against enemies foreign and domestic. And we are under attack from domestic threats to the U.S. Constitution right now. And I'm not sure how it'll play out in the military, but the military is the last line of defense, the last line of defense. We're supposed to have the courts, and we know the courts aren't always on our side, and we also know that the Trump administration is perfectly happy to ignore the courts. So we don't know if the military will come through for us, so we need academia to come through for us. We need people who are willing to not ignore what is happening and say it out loud. That is my biggest problem. Part of the reason I'm sitting here at this crossroads in my life, like I don't know if I can continue doing this, is because I can't pretend this isn't happening. But I have to kind of dance around it happening in order to keep my job, in order to not have complaints filed against me with the state for saying something that upsets people, in order to not be like fired from my job and have my teaching license taken away, to prevent myself from being disappeared and sent to an El Salvadorian gulag because I'm a naturalized American and Donald Trump is now toying with the idea as to whether or not he can take people's citizenship away from them if he doesn't like them. I can't ignore this anymore. You can't ignore this anymore. We've not been here before, but we definitely have like the foreshadowing of where we're going to look at. And I can't ignore it anymore. You can't ignore it anymore. We can't ignore it anymore. This is real. This is happening, and I need you to hear me. So if you've hung around this long and heard all of this, please find it in you to stand up and say no to this. We need all of us together to do this. One person isn't going to take this down. We have to do this together. We have to do this together. And if you want to help free me up so I can say more shit like this without fear of losing my job or whatever, go to my thing on my profile and find my little fundraiser to help Cannon tell the truth for a year without getting arrested. Love y'all, mean it.